If you're an architect, an environmental engineer, or a contractor or property developer that has the problem of oil in a concrete slab, you're worried about the oil coming back up and causing a delamination of the flooring system that you want to put onto that slab, concrete slab. Could be an epoxy coating, a vinyl or wooden floor, or some kind of cement overlay. And you're worried about this oil coming back up and causing delamination, then we have a solution for you. We have our Primer OS. Primer, that's an oil stop primer, and it's developed specifically to soak into the concrete slab and fuse with that oil and prevent it bleeding back up onto the surface. It's actually a primer so that you can then come off that with your epoxy coating or with your other flooring system. So it's a very effective way of dealing with what we call oil bleed back, and avoids the costly process of removing that concrete. This is a much more cost-effective way of dealing with that problem. Do you really need to prime when using an epoxy? It really depends on the type of floor that you have, the concrete floor or the surface, and also the type of epoxy you're using. We prime generally for three reasons. One is to improve the adhesion. The second is to stop outgassing, air and vapor coming up through the concrete. And then thirdly, to increase durability, to put a thicker, more durable surface or system onto the floor. So if you have an epoxy that is very thick, you might want to use a primer first to get better adhesion. The primer will soak in and then let the thick epoxy sit on top of the floor. If you have contamination in the slab, something like oil, then you would want to prime to prevent that oil from bleeding back and delaminating the epoxy top coat. What is CoverShield Primer OS? Primer OS is an oil stop primer developed specifically for stopping oil bleeding back to the surface of concrete. So it's used on oil contaminated concrete, concrete that you might find in an industrial facility, in a workshop, or in a warehouse, and you want to come back and coat that floor with an epoxy or with some kind of cementitious or vinyl or wood flooring system. And you're worried about that oil bleeding back and causing delamination. Primer OS was developed specifically to block that oil coming to the surface. It is a penetrating primer. It has petroleum compounds in it that fuse with the oil and block it from coming to the surface. But at the same time, it provides a prime surface for which you can then coat with an epoxy, a flooring adhesive, or a cementitious overlay. And you don't have to worry about that oil bleeding back. So it's a very cost-effective way. Why is CoverShield Primer OS better than primers that you typically find in a retail store or a big box store? The types of primers that you would find in a typical big box store or a retail outlet are not developed or designed to deal with an oil contaminated surface. Right? Those primers will say specifically that oil can't be present. So you're unlikely to find an oil stop primer in a retail store. These are products that need to be developed specifically that contain compounds that are compatible with oil and will fuse and join with those oil hydrocarbons and stop them bleeding back to the surface. Primers typically work. Primers are typically a thinner lower viscosity type material that soaks into the concrete, soaks into the surface, wets it out, fills up any pores and capillaries, and gives you a better surface to bond to. You're going to get better adhesion with your epoxy top coat or with your adhesive. The fact that the primer penetrates into the surface is going to make it harder and stronger, and it's also going to prevent contaminants and chemicals and moisture coming up from underneath. We have, for example, an oil stop primer that will stop oil coming up. We have a water stop primer that will stop water and vapor coming up through the floor. And at the same time, they harden the surface and provide a good area for, or a good surface for, the top coat to bond to. So what's the benefits of using the Primer OS, CoverShield Primer OS versus a store-bought primer? Well, the Primer OS is an oil stop primer. It's developed specifically for stopping oil bleeding back to the surface of concrete. So if you have an oil contaminated slab and you're planning to put a top coat on that slab, an epoxy, or maybe some kind of cementitious overlay, or perhaps some rubber or wooden flooring, you've got to be worried about that oil coming back to the surface and causing peeling and delamination. Most primers won't address that problem. They can't handle the fact of oil coming back up to the surface. Whereas the Primer OS is developed specifically for that. It penetrates into the surface and fuses with any petroleum-based oil and provides a block or a barrier to that, what we call oil bleed back. So what are the do's and don'ts of using the CoverShield Primer OS? Well, this is a penetrating primer developed to penetrate into the surface of the concrete and provide a barrier to oil bleeding up. So it's important to make sure that the surface is clean first of all, so the primer can penetrate. We recommend you use something like our CoverClean HC, which is a cleaner developed specifically for removing petroleum-based oils from a surface and subsurface. It's a microbial cleaner, so very effective. You don't want to grind or shot blast the concrete. That's definitely a don't, because that's going to drive the oil deeper into the slab. You don't want to generate heat. Certainly you don't want to do that before cleaning it. The product should be roller applied using a 3/8 nap, or it can be spray applied. It does contain some solvent, so you want to make sure that the area is well vented. It's an open area, or you're venting out the solvent odor. It does dry very quick though, so within 4 to 5 hours you can top coat it with an epoxy. So you can recoat the same day, and that smell will dissipate very quickly. Temperature needs to be between 40 and 90 degrees. You don't want it to be too cold, and you don't want it to be very hot. So those are the kind of application conditions. But remember, when you're using this primer, it's going to penetrate into the concrete, and it's going to stop that oil coming back so that you can now top coat with an epoxy or an adhesive system. Why is Primer OS, CoverShield Primer OS, recommended for contractors? This product is a professional use product. The surface needs to be cleaned properly before you apply the primer. The primer itself has some solvent to it, so you need to be trained how to handle those types of products. And it really is designed for industrial or commercial use, where you're trying to protect the slab from the oil coming back up and causing delamination. What should you consider, or what should you look for when selecting an epoxy primer? Well, you're looking for something that is low viscosity. It's a thin product that will penetrate into the concrete and provide what we call maximum wetting out of the surface and deep penetration. If you're dealing with moisture issues or oil issues, you want to make sure that that primer will resist moisture or vapor coming up from the surface or oil coming back from the surface. You want to make sure that it's compatible with the coating that you're going to top coat. If you're using a water-based system, you want to make sure that that primer is compatible with the epoxy, making sure that the epoxy itself is water-based so one doesn't damage the other. You also want to be careful of any restrictions, how to handle the product, whether there's any solvents or any safety issues. These are the things that the key things you need to look out for.